It's a give and take between what you don't want to give up in your work and then also how you're going to fit within this framework of an industry that exists that you want to be a part of because you want the final product of your book on the shelf.
What's good? I'm Nikesha Elise Williams, and this is Black and Published, bringing you the journeys of writers, poets, playwrights, and storytellers of all kinds. Today's guest is Maura Cheeks, author of the novel Acts of Forgiveness. The book is an outgrowth of her 2019 nonfiction article for The Atlantic, American Wealth is Broken, which explores the necessity of reparations for Black families.
A lot of the conversation about reparations is always statistics and politics, and here's why it can't work, and the humanity behind it gets lost. And so I tried to sort of center a family to be like, no, it's actually just about people and about what Black people have been through and what we feel we're owed as human beings.
Be it money or a formal apology, Maura's novel explores exactly what reparations would look like in America today. Why she used fiction as the framework to address the very real critics of the long-stalled federal reparations program. Plus, why she's not ready to take the journey of her character and dig into her own family history. And why she believes when it comes to writing and publishing a book, authors are both the client and the customer. That and more is next when Black and Published continues. Maura, when did you know that you were a writer?
I would say I knew I was a writer in fourth grade. I wrote a play for a contest that my teacher wanted me to enter for the Young Playwrights Association. And I wrote a play called Mr. TP's Deal. And about a man who made a deal to sell his soul to the devil in order to live forever, and ended up winning the Young Playwrights Festival. And I was pretty much hooked from then on.
Having written this play in the fourth grade and won the contest, did you always then pursue writing after that? Like that was the only thing that you wanted to do?
I didn't pursue it professionally because I didn't think it was a realistic career path when I was younger. So I would say I started pursuing writing professionally, seriously in 2018. But I was always like writing on the side, but I wasn't really pursuing it as a career path until 2018.
What were you doing when you were writing on the side?
I worked in marketing. I ran social media for the New York Knicks and for the Olympic Committee. Yeah, I was always sort of writing adjacent, but in a more corporate background.
So then what made you decide to take yourself seriously and really pursue it?
So I was getting my MBA because I thought that that's what I should do, that it was like the next best career move. And I had a moment while I was getting the MBA where I just realized it was not for me. Like I didn't want to stay in the corporate career path. Yeah, then I started pitching essays more seriously to different outlets and started getting published that way, and left my job and started freelancing, and then started writing more seriously. And I applied for and won a fellowship with The Atlantic, which is the article that inspired this book.
Can you talk more about that article? Because I'm assuming your background is in journalism, having worked in marketing, which is all in that communications sphere. So the move to freelancing isn't too surprising. But can you talk more about, I guess, the fellowship and what inspired you to write the article on reparations that eventually led to what we now have as Acts of Forgiveness?
Yeah, I was getting my MBA and sort of like consistently sort of examining the differences between like being in these sort of predominantly white spaces and understanding how, you know, white people had an association with money and wealth, and then sort of like comparing that to my own family's relationship with money. And that was sort of like the basis for the Atlantic article that I pitched in my application to the fellowship, in terms of wanting to write about and research the racial wealth gap. And at the time, it was sort of in the context of a presidential election that was happening. And the Atlantic piece didn't start out specifically being about reparations, but I think the more I researched about just the sort of systemic reasons why Black people and Black families have less wealth, and interviewing people about the different remedies that they've proposed to sort of close this wealth gap, and reparations has never actually been seriously considered on a federal level. And I was, I guess, frustrated with that after finishing the article. And so um, then turned to fiction as a way to examine it a little bit more.
All right. So then in that turn to fiction, and I don't want to jump too far into the book, but in turning to fiction, it's intentionally unclear that the world that this novel is set in is not necessarily near future or the past or exactly the present, but we know there is a woman president who is signing or going to sign this reparations bill that will give Black families who can prove that they are descendants of enslaved people a certain amount of money, right? Why was that particular frame of reparations the one that you decided to explore instead of others?
I think I was trying to imagine what would have to be true for a federal law to pass. And I think some of the criticism you hear and pushback we get when you're advocating for federal reparations is, well, how would people prove that they are eligible, or how would that be implemented on such a grand scale? And so I guess my drive for the book, part of it was to sort of like pick apart that criticism, to say it's difficult, but it could be done. Part of what would make it possible to have a federal reparations program is for the government to make it easier for people to prove their eligibility. And hopefully what the book shares is that it's not just about slavery. It's sort of taking into account the harms from slavery, but also through Jim Crow, through redlining, and then through the present day, even though it doesn't explicitly say like, yes, this program should account for all of those. But yeah, I think I wanted to just sort of pick apart one of the greater criticisms that people put forth when they say, well, a federal program is impossible. Like, how would people prove it? And so the book is sort of to say, well, here's how they would prove it.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to stop that line of questioning before I go all the way into the book. Because I feel it going there. I'm like, no, let's at least talk about like the journey. So
Yeah.
those are the ideas that were rumbling around in your mind after you finished the Atlantic piece in 2019 and were still kind of frustrated even with, I guess, your own lack of answers. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. And so then you turn to fiction to like explore them more deeply. Did you already have the connections to a publisher to like write the book, or were you writing the novel, freelancing, and still trying to go through that publishing process of agent, query, submission, all the things?
So I had an agent, but not an editor. Yeah. So I had an agent at the time that I started writing it, and I started writing it in 2019, and obviously the world was very different then, right? And so, um, I remember I ended up switching agents actually in the course of writing the book and selling it. So when I started writing it, I had one agent, but that's not the agent who actually sold my book. Um,
Can I
and
ask why you switched?
um, it just wasn't a right fit. The agent I had first, I had gotten through my nonfiction work. Um, and I think, there's some agents who want something that is turnkey and like they get it and then they sell it. And I wanted more of a collaboration with my agent to say, like, here's where I am with the process. Here's what I have. Can you help me get it a little bit closer to what I envision the final product being? So that was the main reason I switched. And then my current agent focuses mainly on fiction. So it was more of a genre thing. But all that to say, I remember talking to my first agent at the time in 2019 and sharing the idea for the book. And it was like, oh, wow, well, this is different. It was like it was still very like speculative because I think, the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, all of that hadn't happened when I
Happened, yeah.
first started writing the book. And so the concept of reparations was still very abstract, I think, to certain people. And so when I was writing the book during 2020, it was easier to have a conversation about reparations because it was front and center and people were paying attention to how Black people were being treated in a different way than they were in 2019. And so, yeah, I think technically my book was sold as speculative fiction because it has to be sold in some genre. Like literary fiction isn't a genre that a book can be sold in. So that it had to fall somewhere. And so it still fell in speculative fiction, technically. But I think if you know speculative fiction, it's not really. Octavia Butler is speculative fiction. Mine really isn't, only it is in the sense that I don't specifically name a year and a federal program hasn't happened. So in that sense, it's not, it's speculative in the sense that the federal policy is still very much fiction.
Yeah, I think they're still in the research and discovery phase for the federal policy.
Yeah.
250 some odd years since the end of slavery, we're still in research and discovery for reparations. I just want to let that sink in because it's kind of a moment.
Well, I think, the book, it fictionalizes something that is real, which is HR 40, which is the bill that has yet to pass, which would be the first step in getting a federal program. But it sort of, it imagines that has already passed.
That first step. Yeah. So you talk about the climate being different from when you started writing in 2019 to when you obviously sold sometime 2020 or after. What was the reception by editors? And I am curious about why they stuck with speculative fiction, because it's really given historical to me. I was like, it's historical, it's literary. I mean, yes, there are future elements, but it's not the future. Like it could be now.
Let me think of how to politely say that.
Don't be polite. Don't be polite.
No, I think there were a couple of reasons. I think to editors, it's harder to maybe sell this book as historical fiction, like to market it. So I had 3 editors who were interested who bid on the book, which was great. And I was excited. And I think part of the reason for that was like the current moment of people. I think there was a desire for this book to fit in that current moment, even though that's not how I had originally written it, right? Like I had started writing it before all of this happened. And so I think from a marketing standpoint, it's easier to say like, here's a book that like speaks to the moment that we were in 2020, which was like being more open to the conversation of reparation. Sometimes the nuance in publishing or like trusting the reader is a little bit difficult to navigate because for me, I wrote this book primarily for 2 audiences, like Black people who are like frustrated with the inability to trace their lineage past a certain point. But then it's also for people who question the validity of reparations. And so I think, I don't know. I think it's easier from a marketing or publishing standpoint to say, here's a book about reparations that only looks like to the future, to what a federal program could be, instead of here's why we haven't had one yet, if that makes sense.
It makes sense, but I also wonder, since you worked in marketing, do you justify that to yourself because you used to work in marketing?
I see where they're coming from. And I think as an author, you're in a weird position because you are both the client and the customer in some respects. And so I think, especially as debut authors, you're struggling with the fact that like you really want your book out there. And the industry is really hard to navigate. And if you aren't from a publishing background, which I wasn't, and you don't have an MFA, you're sort of playing catch up, constantly trying to figure out how the industry is actually working.
Can you say more about what it's like to be both the client and the customer? I've never heard an author put it that way.
You're getting paid for something that you produced, um, but you're also able to put this thing out there in the world because of your publisher. And so you have control over your work, but they also have control over certain aspects of like what the final product looks like. And so I think it's a give and take between what you don't want to give up in your work and then also how you're going to fit within this framework of an industry that exists that you want to be a part of because you want the final product of your book on the shelf, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I'm jumping. Um, sorry. But I like you were talking about, having to pitch the book as spec because it had to fit somewhere and it was addressing the moment of when it was sold. But because publishing is so slow, and to think of the moment that we're in now, where it seems all the things that happened in 2020 in regards to race and the uprisings and the calls for reparations or at least DEI programs, all of that is like all a distant memory. And yet your book published in February, as this memory has been fading. What do you make of that landscape now that the book is out and is on the shelves and you are still both client and customer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm proud of the book and I'm proud of what it says and the message that I wanted to convey. And for me, that is going to be, it's something that I wanted to write regardless of the current moment because I started writing it before the events of 2020 happened. So for me, I'm just hopeful that it finds readers who resonate with what I'm trying to say. And I think um, from a from a personal standpoint, of course, I'm frustrated with the sort of like spikes in conversation and people care, and then it sort of goes away. And I think all I can hope is that the book will continue to exist and maybe there will be a time when the conversation of reparations is back in the public sphere and then the people say, oh wow, there's actually this novel that is speaking to that. But for me, I'm sort of the mind that the book exists and will hopefully find readers who resonate with its message regardless of what is happening publicly. And it's tough, especially with the current election about to happen.
Let's jump into the book. If you could read something from it, and then we can dig deeper into the politics of both your novel and the current climate that it was released in. Acts of Forgiveness by Maura Cheeks is a novel that examines what would happen in America if a federal reparations program passed Congress and was signed into law. Anchored on the Philadelphia-based Revel family, who has roots in Mississippi, the book illustrates how money, one form of repair, may still not be enough to heal the harms done to Black people or make them whole in the present. Here's Maura.
Okay, I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 1. The diner was full of people who wanted to be around others the day the Forgiveness Act passed the House. The proximity to precedent felt good. There was no danger, no history yet per se, no need to stop routine completely. So it was enough to sit in the old diner at the blue speckled tables with scrambled eggs and large steaming mugs of coffee. Enough to ask the person next to you to pass the ketchup and also whether they thought this would go anywhere. Not in my day, was often the answer. Enough monotony rubbed off of a dreary fall day for neighbors to linger and comment that forgiveness would never pass the Senate, as the anchor announced the House's intention to vote on it in the evening. The country, the city, the diner, connected by the same wavering thread of expectation. As Willie hurried in, she took up her usual stool beneath the television and tried to look optimistic. But she had imagined when a moment like this one came, she would be sharing the news, not watching it. Writing about representatives wrangling last-minute votes, what families needed to do to prepare for its passage, not sitting as she was now, 34 years old in the same town where she was raised. Most days she successfully calmed the disquiet, but today she couldn't help it and picked silently at her life choices like they were scabs. Vice president at her father's construction company, mother to a precocious daughter from a one-night stand, loving parents whom she lives with. The second half of those ellipses ruined the mirage. For a long time, she was buoyed by the belief that change was around the corner, and now that it was here, she realized she should have been more specific in her faith. The Forgiveness Act, for many reasons, threw this into sharp relief. A waitress arched her back against the counter and pointed the remote at the television, inching the president's voice up several decibels. Everyone in the diner talked over one another, and it was possible to hear both the din of the restaurant as one throbbing sound and the individual pieces of conversation. The men next to Willie threw their voices at the screen as though President Johnson stood ready to take their orders from behind the bar. $50, she's on here tomorrow saying the House delayed the vote. It doesn't work like that. How do you know how it works? At least she's not using war as an excuse. The man to Willie's right, whose bald head glistened under the harsh fluorescent lights, jabbed his knife at the screen. She's all right. I'd let her forgive me. What are you even talking about? I'm talking about her priorities and how they're on straight. They keep killing us, and while everyone else wants to pause and look abroad, she's trying to start fixing what's broken.
Thank you. So you read from chapter 1, but I think the line that sets the tone for me is in the prologue, and it's the last line of the prologue where it says, you can beg for what you want, but once you get it, you could still be left empty-handed. And I wrote in the margin, well, damn. It was like, that's a hell of a statement. You can get the things that you absolutely want. And in context of the novel, reparations is something that, for lack of a better word, Black people have been begging for. And then there's always a conversation about, even if you get it, what would you do with it? The conversation devolves to, oh, it would be squandered, or they buy like Jordans and cars and houses and
the Dave Chappelle sketch.
Right. All the materialistic things without really recognizing that those material signs are a sign of comfort, that you do have enough money to splurge, but that's a whole other kind of conversation. Beyond just the possibility of reparations being paid that the novel starts off with in that section that you read, and then actually happening throughout the course of the book, the heart of the novel to me is a story about the family. And the main character, Wilhelmina, who goes by Willie, her life path is just like thrown off course because of her family, or she allows it. It was a lot. And I was like, I don't know how I feel about all of this. And so like, for me, the politics was in the background because I was like, what is wrong with these peeps?
Yeah.
So I felt there were so many things happening. Why was that the dynamic that you chose to center this book that is largely about what could happen if reparations were paid, around this one trying to be middle class family that's kind of problematic?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wanted to imagine, like, if there was a federal bill, it's not like everything would just stop and everyone would only be focusing on the reparations bill. The family's still messy and they're still trying to live day to day. And so I wanted to capture the sort of messiness of that, while something that Black people have advocated for so long is happening. And so there's different viewpoints in the family about whether it's even a good thing, about whether it's worth the time and energy to even pursue the funds. And so I wanted to just sort of explore the messiness of like life still happening while this large bill is passing. And for me, I think a lot of the conversation about reparations is always statistics and politics, and here's why it can't work. And the humanity behind it gets lost. And so I tried to sort of center a family to be like, no, it's actually just about people and about what Black people have been through and what we feel we're owed as human beings, not like statistics, or it's not about politics really at the end of the day, even though it has to go through the mechanisms to be passed.
You succeeded with the messy family, absolutely. I was like, these people, and I think it was her mother that like worked my nerves the most. I was like, are you kidding me? It was too much. But in it being about people, it's funny, like I read your novel and then I read an essay collection right after it by Julian Randall, The Dead Don't Need Reminding, which is about his own search for his ancestors in Mississippi. And so then I started to conflate the stories of like, wait, no, this one part is fiction and this part It's nonfiction. But what he
Yeah.
says at the beginning of his essay collection is he calls Mississippi Zero Country, and he
Mm-hmm.
says it's the place of all beginnings. And
Mm-hmm.
so in your novel, you have your character, Wilhelmina, go back with her mom to Mississippi to dig in the archives and find the records that she needs. And as we talked about a little earlier, not everybody is going to be able to find those records. Can you talk about, did you take that journey yourself to find your own history, and like what were your findings that helped you inspire that part of the novel?
So I went to Mississippi and did Willie's journey. Like I met with the employees at the archives department, Historic Natchez Foundation, and explained my character and where she was and what information she had. And they sort of like walked me through the process. I have loosely started to trace my own family, but it's really hard because we just don't have the records. My grandmother, I have, some stories from her, but she passed away. And so it's a daunting task. I think I definitely want to do it at some point, but there's also sort of like the emotional hurdle of like being ready to do that journey. And I think I'm not really there yet, if I'm being honest. But I think I put some of that into Willie, and sort of her drive to do it is driven obviously in part by the law, but in part because she actually does want to know. But I've always been frustrated about my family's like lack of history. Part of that is just personal, like no one has really done the work to preserve it or trace it. And then part of it is we just don't have the knowledge or the records. So
In addition to having the ancestry piece, the messy family, and the policy in the background, you
mhm.
also have the protests. Was it difficult or hard for you to imagine and then write out those scenes where you have active protesters and then even violent protesters of groups of mobs of mostly white people protesting the fact that in this fictional world that you've created, Black people are going to get what they see as a free handout?
Mhm. Um, it was difficult to write because I was writing it during 2020. So I was just like so emotional with everything that was happening, like reading about Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. I was just like, I remember writing it and just like crying and like, just having a lot of emotions while I was writing those scenes. And so for me, it was like a little bit cathartic because I was just kind of like putting some of the anger, I think, into it. But then yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like writing about reparations is always so draining because it just seems so obvious to me that it's something that should be passed. And so it's a little bit of getting to a point where like you stop trying to convince people. I think for me, the book stopped being about like, this is why reparations is valid, and more just about like, let me write about these characters and let me like go into this world and imagine what would be happening in America if something like this passed.
And again, that goes back to the messy family. Like for me, yes, I recognize the policy of it and the argument that you're making, but you're not arguing to me or arguing in for of. You're like, this is what it will look like. And some people might be in the midst of losing their houses, or some people might be doing all right and might have an extra little boost, or some people may be able to use it to send their children to college. But all of the stuff that people are going through in life is not going away. So if your family's
Mhm.
trash, your family's still going to be trash, and you're still going to be
Right,
trash with a little bit of money.
right, right,
With a little bit of money.
right.
So in what I'll say is accomplishing, I think, the goal that you set out to write, even if it was a way to escape what was happening at the time that you were writing. Now that it's out again, here we are, 2024, the book is here, it's on the shelves. What do you want readers to take from it?
I mean, I've gotten a lot of great messages from people who say they're like, now I'm inspired to retrace my family tree, which is awesome. I think like if more Black people are inspired to talk to their grandparents or great grandparents, or maybe start like saving some of those records. So that's been cool to hear from readers just say like, oh, it's inspired me to actually like talk to my family members and get some of those questions answered. And then on the other side of that, I think changing the conversation about reparations so that people see that it is, it's not some far-fetched idea that couldn't be implemented. To sort of critically start to think about, like, here's how policy could actually work.
But against all of that, again, your novel starts in an election year, and we are in a very scary election year.
Yeah.
And yet your president has ties all the way back to Andrew Johnson. So I know that moment of making it full circle is intentional. Can you just talk about why?
Yeah, I thought about what would have to be true for a federal policy to pass. And I thought that part of that would be a person in power who feels an actual deep personal responsibility for what has happened. And so I sort of took the stance that maybe it's not enough for the bill to get to the House or get to the Senate. There has to be somebody in power who is like, feels personal responsibility to get it through, to make sure it actually passes. And then it's sort of like a play on the concept of white guilt. Like, can something like good come from that?
So then do you think that there does have to be that guilt or that kind of empathy or feeling of personal responsibility for forgiveness to be possible?
Well, with forgiveness, part of the reason why I named it the Forgiveness Act was sort of to play on the irony of, like, when someone has to give forgiveness, they're still the one that's been harmed. So you can't really like take that harm away, even if the person is willing to forgive. And then in the book, the irony is like, Black people have to prove they're worthy of forgiveness, which is an absurd concept. But I think we've seen time and time again of like how, the government or groups claim to be in support of Black people, but then the harm and the burden still falls on Black people to make it possible. And I think we saw that in 2020 with like all of these DEI initiatives, but the Black employees had to be the ones sort of carrying the burden to say, well, this is how I've been harmed, or this is how you can help me, from the perspective of the white people in the company. It was sort of still, the burden was still on Black people. And so I don't know, in terms of like from a political standpoint, I would hope that it doesn't have to mean that there has to be a personal responsibility. I think if you just look at the facts and if you look at the facts and then like look at the current racial wealth gap, that I think it's 6 times now. The average white family has 6 times more wealth than the average Black family. It shouldn't have to be about personal responsibility. So my hope is that that's not true. For the book, and I think for me, like imagining the world of the book, because a federal policy hasn't passed, for me to get there in the book, I had to imagine someone with enough power, but also like moral responsibility to push it through.
Now that you've written this novel, which is an outgrowth of an article, do you think you've said everything you wanted to say on the issue of reparations, or is there more? And what's next?
I think from a book perspective, I'm done. I mean, in terms of reparations, not from, I will write more books, hopefully, but I think in terms of like writing fictionally about reparations, I think I'm sort of emotionally tapped out. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Hopefully the conversation continues. And I think if, I was sort of like called upon to testify in like the Ta-Nehisi Coates fashion, I would go. But yeah, I think from a fiction standpoint, I'm done.
So I want to move to a speed round in a game before I let you go for the morning. What is your favorite book?
Song of Solomon.
Who is your favorite author?
Toni Morrison.
I knew. So I was like, we're just gonna do these back to back. No stopping. Who is your favorite artist?
Can I say Toni Morrison again?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess. That's a hard one.
Toni Morrison it is. What do you think is the best book to movie or television show adaptation?
Well, Erasure is top of mind. Erasure and American Fiction are pretty good.
If money were no object, where would you go? What would you do? And where would you live?
Well, I'd probably be doing what I'm doing now. So I'd probably still be writing. I would probably do it overlooking the Pacific Ocean, maybe, or the Mediterranean Sea or something.
Name 3 things on your bucket list.
I would like to visit Nigeria. 3 things on my bucket list. I haven't thought about my bucket list in a long time.
Do you have one?
Not really. That's just like my next goal. Like I usually do it like goal. I'm pretty like goal oriented. So that's my next one is to go to Lagos.
Okay. What brings you joy?
Reading next to my dog.
And what brings you peace?
Meditating.
So our game is called Rewriting the Classics. Classic is however you define it. Name one book you wished you would have written.
I love The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton.
Name a book where you want to change the ending, and how would you do it?
Okay, you're coming in hot with these questions.
Embrace yourself for the next one.
Oh my God. Well, I'm looking at The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. And I actually loved that ending, but I was sad that he died. I think like they switch. Well, now I'm ruining it for anyone who hasn't read it, but one character gets shot and then they switch places at the end of the book. Like you find out that someone you're reading about is actually the other character because he assumed his identity. And so I'm sad that that character died. So I might have them both live, even though I do love the ending of that book.
Final question for the day. When you are dead and gone and among the ancestors, what would you want someone to write about the legacy of words and work that you left behind?
I cannot with these questions. I guess I would want I'm like 11 a.m. on a Monday, and we're talking about my ancestors.
Talk about legacy. Yep.
I guess I would want someone to say that my words like changed the way they thought or something.
For 11 a.m. on a Monday. That's a great answer. Thank you. Big thank you to Maura Cheeks for being here today on Black and Published. Make sure you check out Maura's debut novel, Acts of Forgiveness, out now from Ballantine Books. And if you're not following Maura, check her out on the socials. She's at Maura Cheeks on Instagram and Twitter. That's our show for the week. If you like this episode and want more Black and Published, head to our Instagram page. It's at Black and Published, and that's BLK and Published. There, I've posted a bonus clip from my interview with Maura about whether money is enough for reparations to address the harms done to Black people in the United States. Make sure you check it out and let me know what you think in the comments. I'll holler at y'all next week when our guest will be Julian Randall, author of the essay collection, The Dead Don't Need Reminding.
Since 2012, already my mental state had been fraying. Like, I felt like I was dying all the time. And then suddenly, I can't look at a screen. I can't overhear a conversation. I can't go 28 hours without hearing about another person who looks like me or is like me or is shaped or looks like my sister or my nephew or my cousin or whoever, or all of my friends. Each and every one of us is here in this suburb where if we knock on a door, we don't know what's going to answer us. And it can create this feeling like the walls are closing in.
That's next week on Black and Published. I'll talk to you then. Peace.